Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, various nations had paratroops in World War II, and we often talk about the American, the British, and the Canadian Airborne Forces. What about Japan? James Fenelon, author of 4 Hours of Fury and Angels Against the Sun, returns to the channel to talk about Japan's airborne operations. And as we will find out, like with most countries, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I'll bring James in now. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing well, Woody. Thanks for having me.
And you're as a former airborne soldier yourself, we tend to, like gambling, we tend to remember the successes with airborne operations, and we sort of overlook sometimes when it doesn't work, unless it's like Market Garden, when we've been talking about it obsessively. But all nations were struggling in World War II to just find out what to do with airborne soldiers. The concept was there. We can get people out of an aircraft and drop them into a particular part. In your research for this, did Japan struggle with that basic problem like everybody else?
Absolutely. I think you make a great observation there. And I think that is, that's one of the things that's always interested me about the study of airborne operations in World War II. You kind of see it go from its infancy to this idea of, very small units, battalion size elements, often is where it got started for very specific missions. We're going to seize a bridge, we're going to seize an airfield, to then, of course, the expansion, and of course the German attack on Crete was very influential. Largely, you could argue, because it was misunderstood by the Allies in terms of what the casualties actually were. But that spurred, obviously, the Allied expansion into more division size operations. The Japanese pretty much stuck to battalion and regimental size operations. And, to your point, it was a very mixed bag in terms of the success. And we'll talk some more about those details. But it is an interesting study for that exact reason. You kind of see that, it's very often making it up as you go along, so to speak, and the lessons you learn are often, unfortunately, paid in blood in a lot of these operations.
Yeah, and when you take something like armored warfare, there'd been the First World War to look back, and there'd been lots of developments in the 20s and 30s, and there's also at the same time lots of armored warfare going on all around the world for people to kind of examine and refine. But with airborne operations, it's sort of, there's gaps between things happening, and the world attention is on these, when, particularly as you say, when the drops get bigger, the world is kind of watching to see how they go. And no one gets a chance to have many bites at the apple in some ways. And therefore we have the sort of a small sample set in some ways to look at when we come to airborne forces, where you look at, like, I don't know, company size infantry assaults in North Africa. There's 10 happening a week.
That's anyway. Right. And I think it's also it's difficult to replicate the conditions of a true airborne drop in a training scenario, right? I'm speaking with a broad brush here, but by and large, when you're moving tanks from point A to point B, a lot of that is getting them into the right place at the right time, which, practice helps significantly. And I don't want to oversimplify my metaphor here, but a group of guys dropping in the wrong place at the right time, you could make the argument, or at the wrong place at the wrong time, can have a ripple-on effect on a small airborne operation that it's hard to allow for in some cases when you're trying to build up your doctrine or training.
Brilliant. Well, that's enough preamble done. Let's dive in. So, folks, obviously you can fire away with questions, but I think we will be covering quite a lot of ground today in this show. But I'm going to hand over to James to take us through this. So let's go. Off to you, sir.
Yeah, so we will be covering a lot of ground. We'll be covering basically 1940 to 1945 in terms of the Japanese airborne operations. And what the study of Japanese parachute drops in the war is really a micro study, if you will, of the rise and fall of Imperial Japan. And I think from that perspective, it allows us to kind of look at multiple layers of the Japanese operations specific to the airborne, but then how they also reflect the higher level state of where the Japanese military was throughout the war years. And so if we go to the next slide, the Japanese basically started to model their airborne forces after the successes of the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, in 1940. For those of you who are familiar with German airborne operations, the Fallschirmjäger, you may recognize this exit position here, this very aggressive leap from the plane with the arms outflung. These, of course, are photos of Japanese paratroopers, but you can see that they, they modeled a lot of things as we look at their tactics and techniques on the German lessons that they learned. Just a little bit of trivia for everybody who appreciates that kind of thing. There were only 2 belligerents during World War II who equipped their paratroopers with reserve parachutes. One was the United States, and as you can see here, the other was the Japanese Army. This photo on the right is a Japanese Army paratrooper exiting the aircraft. You can see his distinct gold or yellow canvas parachute canopy there, and he's obviously got a reserve parachute on the front there. Now, the reason I emphasize that this is an Army paratrooper is because both the Navy and the Army created their own parachute units. And so continuing on to the next slide, I think we'll spend a little bit of time here just talking about some of the differences. The Navy got a slight head start on the Army. They started training their paratroopers in November of 1940. The Army followed suit pretty quickly thereafter in December of 1940, started training their parachute units. Both services actually formed their parachute units in 1941 after they had enough trained paratroopers to start filling those ranks. And I think it's worth commenting on that in this, like a lot of things, the Japanese Navy and Army were rivals, right? So there was very little inter-service cooperation between the two services. They often formed redundant capabilities, and their formation of parachute troops is no different than that. They had.
I was taken to task on a show a couple of days ago, James, by saying the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Army had a rivalry. Someone said, "Well, no, a rivalry is like the American Navy and Army football game. This is outright hatred. They rivalry suggests some kind of begrudging respect." But it's almost warfare. I mean, some people made the comment that the Imperial Japanese Navy, their first enemy is the Army, then it's the US.
I think you're right. I think you're right. It's hard to overstate that term rivalry. But you're absolutely right. We see this later in the war when the Navy is actively lying to the Army about their success or failures on the battlefield, which has direct implications to how the Army is going to fight their campaign. Yeah, so you're right. Hatred is a better way to put it.
And we had a question being already about did they have a quality transport aircraft to deliver them? Because you just said they were modeled after the Germans. Well, the Germans kind of famously, it was the Luftwaffe that led the way in terms of how to use airborne forces. So they kind of started with the aircraft and fitted the troops to them, whereas the British and Americans kind of started with the notion of having men jump out of aircraft and then kind of found the suitable aircraft for them. Which sort of direction did the Japanese go?
I think the latter. So I think what you see is you'll see, especially as the war goes on, you're seeing them kind of pull together a hodgepodge collection of aircraft that they have available. They did have some transports, as we'll see here in a bit, that were very similar to C-47s. But again, Woody, to your point, the C-47, it was really the C-46 that was really the first Allied or American aircraft, at least, that was kind of tailor-made for airborne operations with double doors and things like that. So it was definitely them working with what they had in terms of that. Now, the Army did have an advantage over the Navy units in that the Army did actually include in their parachute formations or airborne formations dedicated pilots and aircraft as part of their formation. So they did have, there is a recognized benefit of training with the same pilots, training with the same aircraft that you're going to be using. The photos here also show us the German influence, particularly on the Army paratrooper on the right here. He's wearing an overschmock that was definitely based on the German model. The intent here is that you would put on your regular infantry uniform, you would then put on your combat equipment, you would put the schmock on over all of that to prevent it from falling off yourself as you exit the aircraft. And then secondly, probably more importantly, keeping it from getting entangled as your parachute deployed. So you can see the Army kind of embrace that model, whereas the Navy trooper here on the left, they wore a dark green two-piece combat suit with lots of cargo pockets and specially designed pockets for things like first aid pouches, rations, semaphore signal kits, things like that. So they went their own direction with uniforms. And then also most notably, going back to that lack of cooperation, the Navy and the Army didn't even want to use the same personnel parachute. And so these illustrations probably capture it best, but the Navy on the left here, they again were emulating the German model here. That parachute had a single point of connection for the risers behind the jumper's neck, which invariably always resulted in a face-first landing. There was no ability to steer those parachutes, as opposed to the Army model seen here illustrated on the right. Yeah. They're using a model similar more to the British or the American system, with suspension lines from the shoulder, which gives you rudimentary, steering capability and a more favorable position for landing. Looking at the training was pretty similar to what you'd see across all nations during the war who were fielding paratroopers. You can kind of see these guys on the left. They've got a little bit more emphasis perhaps on tumbling. And again, that's going to be directly related to that poor parachute design. That single point of connection is going to do nothing but force you to come in at a pretty steep angle and face first. So knowing how to roll out of that is going to be a critical component. And then of course you've got over here on the right, the guys are in the suspended harness, learning how to adapt that landing procedure as you're dropped from 10 or 12 feet, just to kind of learn how to absorb that landing. Much like the other parachutes used during the war, the Japanese parachutes had a rate of descent anywhere from 15 to 18 feet per second, depending on wind and the amount of equipment you're carrying. Speaking of equipment, let's go to the next slide. Japanese paratroopers during the war, predominantly, with a few exceptions we'll talk about later in the war, used standard infantry weapons. So they had standard infantry rifles, machine guns. Again, emulating the German model, Japanese paratroopers dropped initially only armed with pistols and hand grenades. Their weapons, the rifles, heavy machine guns, maybe some of the knee mortars, were in containers, much like the German tactics of the war. So they would drop those separately. And again, back to your point earlier, Woody, as we get into kind of examining the operations, we'll see how that had a direct impact on the efficacy of their drop techniques, as they had to scramble to get to find those containers and then unload them and get their weapons into service. Both the Navy and the Army units, the Navy troops were organized under what they called Special Naval Landing Forces. They were about 700 men, essentially battalion-size elements. The Army organized theirs under a regimental structure, even though the regiment was only 800 men as well. So both units, even though they called them something differently, were essentially battalion-size elements. As I mentioned earlier, the Army had a little bit more infrastructure. They had their own pilots, aircraft, support elements, things like that. They eventually formed multiple regiments into a raiding brigade, and we'll see some of those units in action in a bit. And then again, back to that redundant capability, the primary mission of both Naval and Army parachute troops was airfield Caesar missions. So their objective was to jump in and then seize airfields to allow then land-based aircraft to position themselves at those airfields and then support follow-on missions. But let's go ahead and jump into it. This map here is looking at basically the Japanese campaign starting in 1942. So this is obviously after the attack on Pearl Harbor, after the Japanese has seized the Philippines and some of those outlying islands. They're now turning their attention to the southwest, if you will, looking at the Dutch East Indies. These red arrows, again, kind of demonstrate the Japanese version of their own island hopping campaign, right? So island hopping is something that, is a term we're very familiar with as the Allies in the United States started pushing their way back across the Pacific, but the Allies had a similar campaign as they began to move into the Dutch East Indies. Of course, after the 1941 oil embargo by the United States and the Dutch, it's important to remember that left the Japanese with just about 18 months of oil reserves. So they were very keen to seize the Dutch East Indies for a couple of reasons, one of which was the securing natural resources such as rubber, tin, and oil, as well as securing what they called this southern resource area by grabbing islands such as Sumatra, Java, Timor. You can kind of, you can look at those islands, and it's very easy to draw an imaginary line there, a perimeter, a defensive line, to protect what the Japanese then viewed as their interior shipping lanes, right? So if you've seized resources in Borneo or Java, and you've got that outer perimeter defense that stretches around to New Guinea and continues up around, Guam, Saipan, etc., you now have theoretical freedom of movement for your cargo and shipping vessels to move those resources back to Japan. So continuing on, we'll see, we're going to look at 3 Japanese airborne operations that took place in early January, February 1942 as part of these campaigns. We're going to look first at the island of Celebes, and I apologize for my pronunciation if I'm getting that wrong. But looking at the next slide, this is a naval operation, the first use of parachute troops in the Pacific theater. And one quick note I want to make as we start to dive into these operations, and I want to paraphrase Woody, a friend of ours, J.D. Hewitt, who introduced me to the great concept of holding history loosely, right? So I think, I'm going to share with you and everybody who joined us today with what I've learned about Japanese airborne operations. There's a lot of conflicting information out there. I've kind of parsed what I could through that, looking at Japanese sources, English sources, Dutch sources. But there's certainly, I think, a lot more scholarship to be done on some of these things. And so that's why I like JD's term of holding this loosely. I think this is a springboard, and certainly there's a lot more to be learned about these operations. But the first one we're looking at here, as I mentioned again, is a naval parachute operation on the northern peninsula of Celebes. It was a combined operation, meaning that the parachute troops were working in conjunction with troops landing amphibiously on the coast. The parachute operation specifically was to seize an airfield on the island. This was going to provide Japanese land-based fighters with an operational radius of 250 miles. If we think back to that map that we were looking at, they're looking again to conduct their island hopping. They want to start moving, so they need those land-based air bases, just like the United States did, as they're going to start working their way across the Dutch East Indies. And so the operation began at 3 o'clock in the morning with amphibious troops landing on the East Coast. That was followed an hour later with more amphibious troops landing on the East Coast at 4 a.m. I think it's worth noting that this demonstrates the Japanese comfort with nighttime operations, right? Something that we'll see throughout the war. Making an amphibious landing in the dark with supporting naval gunfire is, I think it's fair to say that's a complicated maneuver. They did it here on 2 coasts with an hour of each other, landed tanks as well as part of this operation. These guys landing on the coast, their mission was to cut inland and then start making their way south to link up with the naval parachute troops. There were about 1,500 Dutch defenders on the island, and they landed about 2,500 Japanese troops amphibiously. Now at 9:52 in the morning, after those landings had taken place, about 27 transports came screaming in over the airfield at about 500 feet, 520 feet, and they dropped 334 naval paratroopers onto the airfield. They were followed seconds later by 9 Japanese bombers who were coming in and dropping their equipment containers separately. So this, again, we'll see how this unfolds. But the 9 bombers coming in afterwards are dropping all of the rifles and machine guns. The initial 27 aircraft are dropping guys that are armed with just pistols and hand grenades. Now, they immediately come under attack by the Dutch garrison that is manning the airfield. They've landed on a pretty nice drop zone. It's short grass, around surrounding the airfield. So they are able to start working their way towards those containers to get out their heavy weapons. The Japanese are, in some cases starting to move forward to attack the defenders with those pistols and machine guns. I'm sorry, with pistols and hand grenades against the Dutch machine gun positions. They do knock out one Dutch pillbox. They also are attacked by a Dutch light armored car that is kind of driving up and down the airfield, firing into the Japanese as they are trying to get to their heavy weapons. The Japanese knock out that armored car. I think it's worth also talking for a minute here about the commander of this naval unit, this naval parachute unit. He was Captain Horiuchi, and he was famous for writing a poem called Parachuting to Annihilation. And so I think, again, this kind of sets the tone for what we can expect from these Japanese paratroopers. They have a lot in common with their ground force infantry or amphibious infantry, right? It's that fighting spirit, that Yamato Damashi of, if we want it bad enough and if we're dedicated enough, our spirit and aggressiveness can overcome a superior, a more superior, a better armed opponent, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? And so what you see here is you see these guys rushing against these Dutch positions with their pistols and hand grenades. The Dutch do launch a small counterattack with 2 more armored cars. The Japanese managed to knock one of those out. The occupants of that armored car use it basically then as a fortified pillbox until they're forced to flee. The 3rd armored car retreats, and by 11:30 that morning, so about 90 minutes after the Japanese dropped, they have secured that airfield. They then, I agree, exactly. And so what you then see is one company stays in place to occupy the airfield and secure it against any potential counterattack. Another group of about 120 guys starts to move to the northeast towards the small village of Cacao on the shore of that lake there. Their mission is to secure a seaplane base located on the shores of that large lake. They run into a Dutch roadblock with an anti-tank gun in position. Now, of course, the paratroopers at this point had recovered all of their rifles and their machine guns. So they storm past and sweep aside that Dutch roadblock, and they secure the seaplane base about 7 minutes before 2 Japanese seaplanes come in to land at that base. They're bringing in an anti-tank gun of their own, as well as an 11-man medical detachment. And so by the end of the day, the Japanese have secured both of their objectives, the airfield and that seaplane base. And this is where we start to kind of see some of the discrepancies come into play, right? And that is looking at, well, what were the casualties? What was the cost in terms of casualties to secure both of these objectives? And you see some accounts stating that the Japanese paratroopers suffered 32 killed in action, and it ranges all the way up to 130 killed in action. And I think based on what we'll see here in a minute, I tend to believe the higher casualty numbers because Woody, to the great point that you made at the beginning, it's what are we learning as we go along? What do we see is happening here? And you'll see the next naval parachute operation takes into account the lessons learned of casualties suffered when you decide to jump directly onto the objective as they did here. So
there's a quick question for you, James.
Yeah.
Do we know whether the Dutch defenders would have had any inkling of the possibility of an airborne assault coming their way? I mean, Ian, I asked in the sidebar, were the Allies even aware in early 42 the Japanese had an airborne capability?
Yeah, it's a great question. You see over and over again some concern about that when you look at some of the, why they have dispersed troops. Now, to be fair, most of the Dutch troops were up in these suspected landing sites. They did have a reinforced platoon down here at the airfield, plus, some other guys at that seaplane base. So you see concerns about the potential of airborne troops. But I think the overwhelming concern was more related to the likelihood of amphibious troops being landed. But you do see that as a concern of like, well, we need to make sure we've got guys over here for this exact purpose, or were, in some cases you see them delaying moving reserves up because they're concerned that Japanese troops may be landing behind them.
Right. And Happy Dude asked about whether or not there was any Dutch air assets around. I mean, the Dutch East Indies spread out over quite a wide area, but would the Japanese have been worried about interdictions from somewhere?
So there were Dutch aircraft. There weren't very many of them. Of course, at this point, the Dutch, were the Dutch government had escaped and were in England. So it was very difficult for them to manage their forces. A lot of the air assets in the area are actually both British and Australian Royal Air Force aircraft is what you see more of. Than you do Dutch aircraft. But certainly there were some Dutch aircraft. Now, there were no Dutch aircraft at this airfield. They had already evacuated to deeper airfields on the island.
Thank you.
Now, going back to the commander here, Captain Horiuchi, it's, so unfortunately, he ended up overseeing the execution of many Dutch prisoners, as well as several atrocities against locals on the island. And he was later executed in 1948 for war crimes directly related to the operation here on Celebes. But moving on, the next operation, which took place in February of 1942, this was an Army parachute operation. This was on the island of Sumatra. It was, again, a combined operation of using amphibious troops in combination with airdrop troops. The operation got started with landing a battalion of troops on the island off the coast of Sumatra, while 2 additional battalions landed on the coast there. Their mission was to then make their way 50 miles upriver to the town of Palembang. Palembang was the site of an airfield as well as 2 oil refineries. Now, the reason they want to drop airborne troops in, because it was estimated that it would take the amphibious troops about 2 days to make their way up that river, those 50 miles upriver on barges. And they had, the Japanese Navy had previously learned on their attack on Borneo that if you delay your attack against an oil refinery, the Dutch will destroy that oil refinery before you get your hands on it. And so while the primary mission on this operation was, in fact, to seize the airfield, we'll see here as we start to kind of watch this operation unfold, they definitely did also want to secure 2 of these oil fields. So this was one of the missions here of the Japanese parachute troops. There were about 2,000 Dutch defenders on the island. This operation has the distinction from a Japanese perspective of being the largest and most successful of their airborne operations. All told, they fielded about an armada of 150 aircraft flying in for this mission. That included 80 fighters for escort duties. There were some hurricanes stationed on the island here, and so that was a concern of the Armada as they were flying in. And then it also included 34 transports to drop troops and several bombers as well, not only to hit the target beforehand, but also to, again, drop those containers in a separate lift. So if we zoom in on the town of Palembang, we'll kind of look at how this operation unfolded. So there's a lot going on at the same time, which of course is one of the advantages of being able to drop troops in where you want them. So we're gonna start up at the airstrip, which, as I mentioned, which was the primary objective of the operation, and then we'll zoom down over to the bottom corner of the map and talk about what specifically happened at the refineries. So as I mentioned, what's going on now, you've got those troops landing on the coast. They're going to take, a day and a half, 2 days to work their way up the river. At 11:26 in the morning, the Japanese Armada zooms in, the 151 aircraft. There's an observation aircraft kind of in front, providing navigation as they come in. Their initial objective for those first transports is to drop troops around the P1 airstrip outside of Palembang. Palembang, just to give you a sense here, has got about 108 civilians living in it. So it's a pretty good sized town. The airstrip is several miles outside of town. It is home base to some hurricanes who have taken off in response to the amphibious landings. The first initial drop of troops, about 180 guys, land off target. They land further to the southeast than intended. That's kind of represented there by that parachute with the arrows moving back towards the airstrip. So they land in some unexpected terrain. They have some difficulty in recovering some of their equipment containers. They have one stick that drops completely off course, and that's represented by that parachute down by the road. These 20 paratroopers, though, immediately kind of seize the day, so to speak. And the first thing they do when they realize they've landed astride the road there is they cut the telephone lines running from the Dutch garrison in town to the garrison up at the airstrip, and kind of send everything into pandemonium now that there's not any way for those two elements to communicate. The Japanese commander, his intent was to air land or belly land his aircraft with an anti-tank gun aboard. That aircraft lands off target and essentially comes down in swampland, where that commander is effectively taken out of the fight as he's spending his time trying to figure out how to get that anti-tank gun across the swamp and onto dry ground. Now, another 60 troopers dropped immediately to the west of the airfield. They dropped on target on their drop zone. The issue there is that aerial reconnaissance photos led them to believe that they were going to be landing on a flat, grassy field. And what that actually turned out to be was a field filled with 6-foot-tall reeds. And so you can imagine these guys land in the reeds. The reeds are over their heads. They're having a hard time finding each other. They're having a hard time finding their equipment containers, which come in after them. So again, in the spirit that we saw earlier, these guys with their pistols and hand grenades, many of them just start moving due east to attack the airfield. The defenders of the airfield, in this case, have lowered some of their anti-aircraft guns, using them in the ground fire role. It becomes a pretty intensely pitched battle there. A number of the British aircrew start to retreat back into town. They're also simultaneously trying to set alight any of the aircraft that are still on the airfield. They're also setting fuel afire. There's a fuel truck with a couple of other cargo trucks making their way south. They run into that Japanese element that has cut the telephone lines. So they set up an impromptu ambush. They attack that fuel truck again with their hand grenades. It turns over as it's trying to speed down the road. That creates a roadblock that the Japanese then take advantage of. There's a group of Dutch that are moving their way up from the city to kind of get to the airfield. They've got a armored car in the vanguard there. That armored car is again attacked by the Japanese, who capture it. They then drive it up to the airfield to aid their attack into the airfield. And by early evening, that airfield has been successfully secured by the Japanese by the Japanese airborne troops. That's then going to give them an airfield for further attacks across Sumatra. Now, zooming into the other contingent of troopers that are dropping down to secure the airfield. So we need to go back in time a little bit to just 4 minutes after the initial drop. So those guys at the airfield started dropping at a little bit before 11:30. 4 minutes later, 60 additional troops drop into that oil refinery on the left there, the BMP refinery on the west. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a Japanese wartime painting that kind of captures this scene pretty nicely. I think, again, it does a great job here of showing the Japanese going into action with their pistols and hand grenades. That BMP oil refinery was defended by about 60 Dutch defenders. So it was a pretty evenly matched battle, 60 Army paratroopers, 60 Dutch defenders. The Japanese troopers were able to recover their equipment from those containers pretty quickly. They started moving against the Dutch defenders, overtaking one of their machine gun nests. Another platoon then started to flank its way around to the west, fighting their way through a residential area and attacking the refinery from the side, cutting their way through a fence. As they started to swarm into the refinery, they started finding Dutch demolition charges. They started disarming those charges, pushing the Dutch defenders back. The defenders fell back. The Japanese set up a pretty tight perimeter around the refinery. Despite multiple attempts by the Dutch to counterattack, they weren't able to make their way back into the refinery. During the battle, though, some of the oil storage tanks were punctured in the shootout, and a mortar round did set some of those alight. But by and large, the BMP refinery was largely seized intact by the Japanese paratroopers. Now, going over further to the east, if we go to the next slide, this was the action unfolding at the NKPM facility. I think if I recall correctly, it was owned by Standard Oil. The Japanese dropped 39 troopers to attack this refinery. They landed about 700 meters off target in a swamp area. There was a road leading directly through this swamp area to the main gate of the refinery. The Japanese platoon, essentially we'll call it, started to make their way up that road, which was under fire by a Dutch machine gun at the front gate of the oil refinery. This attack stalled significantly after the Japanese platoon leader was killed during his assault on the Dutch pillbox. And it wasn't really until almost 11 o'clock at night that this group of paratroopers managed to make their way into the refinery. By that point, the Dutch defenders had actually withdrawn under cover of darkness back into the city, where they then started to help the civilian population evacuate from Palembang city. The Japanese were initially celebrating their success of having secured this refinery, but at 6 o'clock the next morning, several demolition charges that had been set by the Dutch defenders started to explode, and set basically the entire refinery was a loss, as it was all of the oil was enveloped in flames and burned the refinery pretty much to the ground. Now, a second lift of paratroopers were dropped onto the airfield, and by the time that the amphibious troops had made their way up the river, the Japanese Army paratroopers were in control of that one refinery, the airfield, and the town as well. The amphibious troops making their way up the river had suffered some serious casualties. They lost about 20 barges on their way up the river due to British aircraft strafing that effort to make their way up the river. Casualties, again, are a bit tricky to figure out, but it's estimated that the Japanese Army paratroopers suffered about 30 men killed in action. A lot of that was from fighting around that roadblock and then up at the airfield there, and they suffered about another 48 wounded in action. The Japanese claimed to have killed about 500 of the Dutch defenders and captured another 500 odd more. It's generally considered, though, that those numbers are pretty exaggerated.
Right.
And there are, of course, accounts here again of the Japanese paratroopers killing wounded British and Dutch soldiers that they had captured at that roadblock as they were engaged in making their way towards the airfield.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions coming in, and one is of a comment, really. Looks like they may have taken notes from Crete and Ebon Mayal. I might be wrong, and I can see parallels in things, but I can also see that the Japanese are doing this the same way they're doing the Malayan campaign, which is all ground-based. It's just sort of don't let that intensity drop. Keep on going. The Japanese, it seems like the Soviets almost in World War II, had an ability to kind of a stamina that perhaps Allied units didn't have, for that keeping things going for a considerable number of hours. But you said about the fact they've obviously taken some inspiration in terms of the smocks and the getting out of the aircraft. But do you see that they're looking at German operations, or is it just they're just doing their own Japanese thing via the method of parachuting?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I definitely think Crete was probably a model. I mean, the initial stuff was more the airdrops into Holland. than it was necessarily the glider operations of Eben and Mail. The Japanese did have glider troops. They never really used them in combat. They used them later to kind of reinforce the Philippines at one point, but they never really used them in direct combat, like landing on the objective like the Germans did.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth noting the stamina that you talk about here, just the sheer aggressiveness. And I think it's fair to use the term fearlessness, really. I mean, you have to kind of acknowledge that these guys are not going to stop until they're either successful or they're dead. Those are the only two real options they have here. You don't see a lot of withdrawing to regroup and trying again. It's just a constant, moving forward. There was an account in here of, one of the Japanese paratroopers had made it into the refinery, was wounded again, as something that you see not infrequently in the Pacific theater, as the Dutch garrison went up to capture him. He killed himself with a hand grenade. So you see, that same suicidal spirit, in these guys, just as you see in many of the other Japanese campaigns as well.
Brilliant stuff. We had a couple of questions about going back to the aircraft. So Kevin asked, what type of drop plane did the Japanese use capacity? And Trentelenko, can you ask James about the Japanese transport planes in these early war operations? What types and organization? I mean, when we've talked in the past about Varsity, Market Garden, there's all these debates of who's in charge of the delivery. Do the Air Force do the delivery, or do the paratroopers tell the Air Force what to do? In these early operations, who's in charge and how are they doing it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the advantages of the Japanese Army airborne model is that the aircraft and pilots are organic to that unit, and so probably have a lot more coordination and a lot more understanding of what needs to happen there, as opposed to perhaps the Navy. Again, it's Navy paratroopers are being flown by naval pilots. I don't necessarily, I know that they were using separate bomb groups to drop their containers. And by and large, that seems to have worked. There was some concern that, not having organic pilots to bring in the containers would be a problem. But based on my analysis and studying, those pilots did a pretty good job of dropping the containers, right on target, albeit in some cases in unfavorable terrain. You didn't really see any examples of, the troops landing in one area and the pilots not being able to fly them. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not a Japanese aircraft expert. I can answer the question about capacity. I want to say that it was, on average, it was 12 to 14 guys per transport plane. But I don't want to get over my skis on telling you what kind of transport it is. I can follow up later because I've got that in my notes, but,
okay. Thank you. Yeah. And Gary mentioned, an observation for the Dutch to have burnt the refineries and put up such a hard fight. They must be commended. Plus a huge bottle by the Dutch and British facing such a fierce adversary. And I think, we forget that because this Dutch army would have been similar to the kind of British territorial force. It's an overseas police garrison in some ways. It's not that they're not going to have the most up-to-date weapon systems and the training. It's foreign service. I'm saying that like it's a negative. I'm saying it's respect. It's not, it's like the British Army. There's the home battalions that are up to date with the latest, and the overseas battalions are different. And these guys across, even in the Malayan campaign, a lot of them put up a damn good fight before they succumbed, and it's a testament to their courage if they didn't necessarily have the equipment and up-to-date methods to deal with things.
I agree. I think that's a great observation, and I think it's also interesting because you also see with these Dutch troops in particular around these oil refineries. There's a hesitation in some ways to demolish these oil refineries because again, it's a source of revenue for the Dutch government in exile. And so it's not just a foregone conclusion that, okay, let's just blow it up and run. There's a real sense here of responsibility around, we will blow it up and run if we have to, but we want to time that right so that, if there's a chance of us holding on to this, then that's a known factor in terms of, how these assets are being used. And again,
we know we're looking at this part of the war with a full understanding of all these events happening concurrently, you know, from Pearl Harbor in December, right, you know, to January to February. This is a constant attacks over thousands and thousands of square miles, with each of these individual islands and locations not having the full picture about where the Japanese are going and what they're doing. So they're having to make decisions off the cuff a little bit, as you say, about the oil reserves. You know, for all they know, there might be some massive, great allied fleet coming down to save the day. So, you know, a lot of decision making put on people who had limited information. I think, you know, that's a, you know, John Marshall talked about the Malayan campaign from that regard, is that no one had the full picture.
That's right. And especially, you know, if we look at this operation specifically, I think that's, again, a great micro study of that is, you know, you've got your telephone lines cut. You don't really have any radios that are working. You've got guys at the airfield that don't know what's going on in town. You got guys in town that don't know what's going on in the oil refinery, and then back the other direction, right? And so it is, you know, to whoever made the comment there about the Dutch defenders, there's a lot of important decisions being made at the lowest level as to what to do and how long to hold off these attackers.
And, you know, and if you're witnessing an amphibious assault, you can kind of see the number of ships out there. You can have some estimation of what the size force is, and they're coming at you from one direction. I mean, when airborne operations work well, it's that it creates that confusion when there's two guys coming to you from the east and two guys coming from the west, and so on and so forth. And is how many people are coming at you? Where are they trying to go? How many more are behind it? And those first few hours for the defender are always based on limited information. You know, as you're writing about right now in Normandy, the Germans on that first day had very little idea about what was going on and where people were going, which gives the attacker that advantage of, if you can press your initiative at that point against the confused enemy. And the Japanese clearly are doing a similar situation here.
That's right. Yeah, they are taking advantage of every opportunity they can to move forward against a very confused and you know, concerned garrison, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Great stuff.
Let's move on. So this is the second naval operation, and I'm emphasizing that because, again, I want to carry forward that lesson learned component that we talked a little about earlier, and why I suspect that the higher casualty numbers, because in this case, what the naval paratroopers have decided to do is actually offset from the objective, land almost 10 miles away, with the intent of giving them more time to get into those weapons containers, get organized before moving to their objective, which in this case is another airfield, Penfui Airfield on East Timor. This is another combined operation in that it started off with amphibious troops landing on the southern coast of this peninsula, another dawn landing, which was initiated with naval shellfire from off-coast Japanese naval ships. The landings took place on the south. Now, this island was defended both by the Australians and the Dutch. The airfield here, Penfui, was roughly halfway between Australia and Java. And so the Australians were using it as a midway point. That was about a 1,600-mile air route between those two locations. The Japanese wanted to, deny its use to the Australian Air Force, and then also take advantage of it themselves for their eventual attack on Java. So the troops landed at dawn on the coast there. Most of the defenders, there were about 1,000 Dutch troops up in the town there, Koepang. On the north coast, they had about 650 Dutch troops on the island as well. Now, this is where you kind of start to see the whole plot fall apart for the naval paratroopers. So the landings took place at dawn. By 5 o'clock that morning, the company of Australian infantry guarding the airfield had already started to destroy it. So they're setting alight to the control tower. They're burning the barracks. They're doing their best to damage and destroy the airstrip itself. They're setting alight fuel, blowing up bombs, and burning any unserviceable aircraft that are still there. 5 hours after that, at 10 o'clock in the morning, is when the Japanese start to drop their naval paratroopers, as I said, 10 miles to the northeast of the town. They drop about 300 guys from 28 aircraft at 10 o'clock in the morning there. They immediately start consolidating, getting their equipment out of their containers. Now, the Australians at this point are actually more worried about the fact that the Japanese troops have dropped along this main road at crossroads there, which could be used as their primary evacuation route deeper into the island. So the Australians quickly send some forces, a company of engineers, to attack the Japanese. Two Australian engineers, combat engineers specifically, are credited with setting up a machine gun along the route of the road there that prevent the Japanese naval paratroopers from moving forward. That kind of results in a standoff or a stalemate. While this is happening, the Australians are moving more troops forward along that road to counterattack into the Japanese landing. The Japanese don't really have enough strength to fight their way past, the growing Australian garrison. This stalemate lasts till after dark, and around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, the Japanese commander decides that he's going to start moving overland towards his objective. It's now been several hours. He has not moved towards the airfield as intended. He's now moving, carrying his wounded overland through the jungle, moving very slowly. That element only gets about halfway to the airfield by 10 o'clock the next morning, when a second airlift of another 300 some odd naval paratroopers drop back at the original drop zone. Now, the first commander sends a runner back to advise these guys that they shouldn't move up the road. They've already quickly figured this out because they're now under attack by the Australians that have manned that roadblock there, are trying to secure that exit route for the other forces to withdraw. Simultaneous to this, of course, those amphibious troops that have landed along the coast have been pushing north, and they're moving towards their objectives, which include the port up at Koepang. Another element has peeled off and at this point has secured that airfield before the naval paratroopers have gotten there. That second group of paratroopers now starts to move overland to join that first group. Together, it takes them about another day and a half to actually make their way overland. So by the time they've gotten to the airfield, it had already been secured by naval landing troops. You could call this one pretty much a disaster in terms of the operation. It's estimated, and these are Japanese sources for these numbers, but it's of the 631 naval paratroopers who landed, about 78 survived this mission here. So the Australians really took the fight to these guys up there, and then these guys were just struggling to carry their wounded and to move across the island. So pretty disastrous result for the naval parachute units, which pretty much resulted in, of course, now we're, as we're moving through our timeline here, this is late February of 42. We start to move into mid-February. That's the Battle of Midway. The Japanese offensive operation has pretty much ground to a halt. It's now becoming more of a defensive action. Yeah. The Japanese Navy elects to disband or dissolve the naval parachute units. They get rolled into other naval landing forces, and pretty much all of those guys that had survived these earlier operations were all decimated in the battle for Saipan. But continuing forward, the Army did keep they did maintain their parachute units. They evolved from earlier learnings. This is a photograph of Japanese paratroopers in a training jump. I believe for the aircraft fans, I think this is a Lockheed aircraft. I'd have to go back and look, so don't quote me on that. But what you can see here, and the reason I chose this photograph is the guys are now starting to jump with their weapons. So these guys have got their rifles. They're going to lower those on lanyards, similar to what we've seen, the famous leg bags, or the way that, the British and American paratroopers lower their gear. It's worth noting that Japanese officers are jumping with their samurai swords. They're dropping, they've got those in lanyards, and they're lowering those as they come into land. But by and large, we don't see any more parachute operations until 1944. And so if we go to the next slide, by, of course, this time, the Japanese offensive has come completely to a halt. The American campaign is pushing its way through the Pacific, largely on two fronts. That's one led by Admiral Nimitz up to the north there, and then General MacArthur is pushing his way out of New Guinea and into the Philippines. This map kind of shows where we are in December of 1944, and we're going to zoom into that red rectangle there and look specifically at the island of Leyte, which is in October of 1944, where MacArthur fulfilled his famous pledge of "I shall return" with his landing on the Philippine Islands. He landed several divisions here. You can kind of see the American movements here on the green arrows. The Japanese on Leyte are largely occupying the west coast, on Ormoc Bay. The island is characterized by very rough, serious terrain in the central mountain range. And so the American campaign runs into that wall of mountains, which is a formidable natural obstacle to a mechanized army such as the United States Army. So they then start to transition to go around to the north and around to the south in a pincer movement. Those arrows cutting across the mountains are representative of the 11th Airborne Division, which if you're interested in that, check out Woody's show on the 11th Airborne Division in the Philippines.
And the link to James's book is in the description below. Of course it is. Yeah.
Shameless plug. But the 11th Airborne Division is moving across the island there essentially as light infantry. And this is where we see the next Japanese airborne operation. So one of the things that MacArthur is intent upon is seizing airfields on Leyte. He needs this to support his ongoing campaign against other islands in the Philippines, specifically Luzon. He is running on a timeline here because his aircraft support right now is largely carrier-based. The Navy is antsy. They don't like keeping their assets loitering offshore, particularly as we're starting to see now the use of Japanese kamikaze planes. So MacArthur wants those airfields. The Japanese obviously don't want him to have those airfields because, one, they know that once MacArthur gets ground-based aircraft, he's now got what he needs to move on to other islands. But just as importantly, from a Japanese perspective, these air bases are going to allow MacArthur to cut off that southern resource area, right? So when we think back to the original campaign in 1942, Japanese are seizing those assets. Airfields in the Philippines are going to give the Americans range to shut off those sea lanes, further constricting the Japanese ability to move those supplies back to the home islands. And so we're going to talk about two Japanese airborne operations here on Leyte. The first takes place against those airfields, and we'll come back and talk about number two here in a minute. But zooming into that number one area there on the next slide, that takes us into this area. Dulag is off the coast there, and there's a number of these airstrips. Collectively, they're kind of referred to as the Burauen airstrips. There's 3 of them there. These airfields are familiar to the Japanese because the Japanese used them during their occupation of the Philippines. Now, the Japanese think that MacArthur already has land-based aircraft here. They think that this is being used by P-38s and B-25 bombers. Their mission is going to be to drop troops in here to not only secure these airfields, but also to destroy all of the aircraft that they think they're going to find here. Now, the scheme of maneuver here is there's going to be Japanese troops, ground-based troops from Japanese Army infantry divisions. They're going to fight their way across those mountains. They run into the 11th Airborne that is going the opposite direction. So on the morning of December 5th, only about 300 Japanese infantry have made their way over the mountains and into the valley here. They began, again, because of lack of communication, they began their attack against the Burauen airstrip early. They were not informed that the airdrop had actually been delayed by a day. So they go into action. They're essentially attacking into the rear area of the 11th Airborne Division. So this is kind of the logistical base for the 11th Airborne Division. The 11th Airborne Division headquarters is there in the town of Burauen. They do happen to have a couple of battalions of glider infantry that they send in to attack against the Japanese ground troops. The next day, on the 6th of December, At about 6 o'clock in the evening, several Japanese bombers come in and start bombing the airstrips. They are followed very quickly by several airdrops. Now the Americans have got anti-aircraft guns at these airstrips. Those anti-aircraft guns throw the Japanese armada kind of into disarray. They end up dropping the vast majority of their troops. Around 462 Japanese paratroopers land between the Buri and Bayug airstrip. A handful of others land near the San Pablo airstrip. This is right at dusk, right? So the sun is setting, and these Japanese paratroopers, as is characteristic of the other attacks, immediately go into the attack. They have the advantage this time of dropping with their weapons because they were expecting to find, airfields jam-packed with aircraft. They've got a lot of demolition charges. So they don't find the fighter and bombers that they expected, but they do find the 11th Airborne Division's armada, and I say that in quotes, of observation aircraft. Right. And so General Swing was supplying his campaign up in those mountains with using light observation aircraft. And these guys would take off from these airfields, fly up into the mountains, and then drop ammunition and food. There's, depending on which airstrip you're talking about, all told, the division had about 20 of these aircraft. The Japanese paratroopers going in action destroy all of these pretty quickly in their attack. And now the sun is set, it's nighttime, and it's complete pandemonium here in the division rear area. And it's hard to kind of overstate the level of pandemonium. You've got fratricide going on as guys are shooting at anything that moves. You've got mini perimeters being set up all over the place as the American, engineers and artillerymen who are back here are being pushed into the fight as infantrymen. You've got a lot of these airfields, again, they're being set afire. So fuel's on fire, planes are on fire. You've got that, shadows darting everywhere, machine guns firing, ammunition exploding. The next morning, General Swing manages to get the 149th Infantry, a couple of those battalions that had landed on the coast. He moves them up into battle. It's their first combat experience. Everybody has underestimated the number of Japanese troops that have actually dropped into the area. And so, they're sending a bunch of guys in. They think it's against a platoon. These Japanese paratroopers have dug in. And basically it takes over 5 days for them to wrestle back control from the paratroopers to re-secure these airfields. And that has a ripple-on effect up in the mountains for the 11th Airborne Division in particular. These guys are now going 5 days without any of that resupply that I talked about. So they're not getting any food, and they're having to continue to fight the Japanese infantry that are up in those mountains. And so from this perspective, almost every Japanese paratrooper that jumped into this area died in place. A handful of them managed to escape into the mountains and eventually made their way over to join the forces over on Ormoc Bay. But by and large, I think it was pretty much 100% casualties here as those guys just dug in on those airstrips and refused to surrender or retreat.
And it shows up some of the complications of airborne warfare. I mean, they've managed to get these aircraft in, and there's questions in the sidebar. They obviously got through the radar cover, US fighter cover, blah, blah. Some part of it works really well, the infiltration part of it, and then they all kind of die on the ground. It's airborne.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great. It's a great observation actually, because these guys flew in from Luzon, so they were actually flying out of an air base near Manila.
Yeah.
And initially, again, there was a smart move to come in at sunset because everybody had a very hard time recognizing what type of aircraft these were. The transport aircraft in particular looked very similar to C-47s. And again, I apologize, I don't remember the nomenclature of those aircraft, but they were 2-engine transports. A lot of guys on the 11th Airborne Division, because they had been using these light observation single-engine planes, a lot of guys on the airfield actually thought that they had finally gotten them C-47s and that they were going to land to then start using those for resupply operations. And so there was a bit of hesitation initially, and then it wasn't until the bombers started coming in and unleashing salvos, and then guys were seeing the red circle insignia on the wings that they started to realize that these were enemy aircraft. And so they had the advantage of coming in pretty low from Manila, popping up to drop their guys, and then it was estimated that about all told here about 15, 17 aircraft were shot down, but most of those were after they had already dropped their guys, and obviously a number of those were probably bombers as well.
Wow. Well, moving on. Fantastic stuff, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. So moving on, the next operation took place further west on the island. And so the Japanese tried to reinforce those guys at the Burauen airfields, but the weather closed in and they were unable to drop the rest of the regiment there. So what they decided to do was they were going to drop the rest of the regiment on Valencia airfield, which at this point was essentially behind Japanese lines. So view this operation as purely a reinforcement. So over 6 lifts, again, flying in from Manila, they dropped 481 paratroopers to reinforce the Japanese garrison there on the coast. They had about 1,700 Japanese troops were still at this location at this time. So they were reinforced by a little less than 500 paratroopers. These guys predominantly were responsible for the rear guard action of a fighting withdrawal as these Japanese forces started moving west deeper into the island. By mid-December, there were only about 47 of those paratroopers still alive. And by the end of the war, when this Japanese element, which had been whittled down by the American attack, Filipino guerrillas were actually very aggressive in attacking this formation as they were trying to evacuate. Only about 17 of the Japanese paratroopers made it to the island of Cebu and survived the war from the Army regiment here that ended up dropping into the Philippines. And so the last operation we're going to cover, and this strictly speaking is not a parachute operation, but it's worthy of mention because it does involve Army paratroopers. They just were going to be used in an air landing role.
Right.
And so in April-May timeframe, the Japanese Army formed a special volunteer unit made up of paratroopers from the raiding regiment. They had about 126 paratroopers who volunteered for this mission. They were supplemented by 10 intelligence specialists. And they were a special, we'll call it special attack or kamikaze, suicide unit, for lack of a better word. And their original mission was they were trained around B-29s. So by this time of the war, the United States is pummeling Japan with B-29s. This unit was formed to attack B-29s at their air base. They had actually built mock-ups of B-29s to practice on. They had developed their own special demolition charges, pole charges to attach demolitions. They had formed rope or chain charges where you could throw the charges, a series of charges over the fuselage or over the wing to destroy that aircraft. There were several aborted attempts to launch that unit against the B-29 airfields. But by late May, of course, the United States Army and Marines had secured, or were in the process of securing, Okinawa. Those airfields were then being used to launch further attacks against the Japanese mainland. And so this unit was put into action against the Yontan airfield on Okinawa, which had been occupied at this point largely by Marine air units. There were no B-29s there, but there were a bunch of Corsairs, some C-47s, etc. And so on the night of May 24th, kamikaze planes started attacking picket ships off the coast of the airfield there to kind of create conditions favorable for these transports to start flying in. There were about 12 aircraft carrying these 136 raiders. Many of them were shot down as they were coming in over the ocean. 4 of them were shot down as they approached the airfield. The pilots managed to crash land those planes close enough to the airfield to where survivors of the crash landing managed to, extricate themselves from the wreckage and immediately went into attack at the airfield. One aircraft did successfully belly land or air land on the runway there. It came to a rest just under the control tower. All 12 of those raiders got out of the aircraft, immediately went into attacking the control tower. They managed to set two fuel dumps alight, destroying about 70,000 gallons worth of fuel. They did destroy 3 Corsairs, 4 C-47s, and a couple of other aircraft. At this point, this was another nighttime attack. These guys had come in right at nighttime around 10 o'clock. And so again, what you see is, again, the pandemonium here, right? And so it was estimated that over 30 aircraft were damaged in this attack, but most of those aircraft were actually damaged by friendly fire of guys on the airfield, again, shooting at anything that was moving. About 18 Marines were wounded. A lot of that is, again, credited towards friendly fire, as just nobody really knew what was going on. You've got fuel dumps afire, you've got airplanes crashing and landing, and guys, running all over the place screaming. All told, you had about 69 Japanese air crew and raiders who were killed and buried here near the airfield. By and large, the mission, you could consider it to be unsuccessful. The airfield was back in operation the next morning. The Americans just simply had to move the burnt and damaged aircraft out of the way and resumed air operations the next day pretty quickly. All right, this last one is, I debated whether or not I should include this or not, but I decided that it was a curiosity piece, and you never know when somebody out there might have more information, so I decided to include it. Strictly speaking, it's a balloon operation, not a parachute operation, but it kind of fits under the umbrella of airborne operations. I did find this from a Japanese source, which is why I maybe give it a little bit more credibility. But again, I'd love to hear more if anybody knows about it. But this is a brief story about the 1st Mobile Brigade. And this was a unit formed in Manchuria. It was 2 regiments of troops. Now, these are full-size regiments, allegedly, of 2,200 some odd troops. These guys were trained and equipped, and again, I want to overemphasize allegedly. Like I've not been able to find a lot of documentation on this, but the intent here was that these guys would be taken aloft on balloons. They would have a pilot balloon that they could release, which would reduce their buoyancy, and then they had a control valve attached to their main valve, the main balloon, that would then allow them to descend to their target. The intent here was that these guys were going to be used if the Soviets entered the war against the Siberian Railway. They were never deployed, and the 1st Mobile Brigade was destroyed, again, almost to a man, when the Soviets did attack through Manchuria. And so we don't have a lot of evidence around what the how likely this was, if this was anything more than a paper exercise or an idea. But we did see the Japanese use of balloon bombs. Some of those were carried by into the United States, so it was something that they did experiment with, they were familiar with. So anyway, I include it here more as just a curiosity piece than anything else.
It certainly is curious. It definitely fulfilled that requirement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, so we'll wrap it up here with just a quick update on Japanese Airborne Forces. So they formed their self-defense force in 1958, formed a airborne brigade. They have, they're one of the few units within the Japanese self-defense force that has a offensive capability. They call that part of their dynamic defense force, which is an evolving capability of the Japanese currently. The mission of the brigade ostensibly is to combat enemy paratroopers or enemy special forces units operating within the home islands. This gives them the capability to rapidly deploy these troops where they need to in such an eventuality. The brigade did send 170 paratroopers from their unit to Iraq in 2007 to serve with coalition forces. And I think it's worth ending on the note that the Japanese paratroopers now routinely train with their former adversaries, the Australian paratroopers and American paratroopers, and they conduct joint exercises. not infrequently, giving us a great bookmark or end note as to where we have the progress we have made since World War II in terms of friendly relations.
Yeah. And there's your end slide there. So again, folks, James's book about 11th Airborne in the description below. And we had Brian was watching, going back to the operation on Leyte there. He was saying, because his grandfather was there, Irv Friedman with the 511th. And he was saying, when I heard my grandfather tell me this story, I was scared shitless. So the operation there with the confusion, I mean, so it's nice to have someone in the audience with a connection there. And I'm glad you finished with the fact that Japan carried on with its airborne forces, because every nation pretty much did. The British, Americans, Germans, we all still have airborne capability. And sometimes, it's evolved a bit, but nobody threw the baby out with the bathwater. Despite the mixed success that every nation has, the concept has not been thrown away.
That's right. That's right. And I think every nation is going to want to have that capability. You can make some arguments, some good arguments around the state of anti-aircraft weaponry and what that requires to have the size of drops that we saw in Normandy or Market Garden. But certainly, the capability to drop troops when and where you want them still remains a threat that the enemy has to consider. So it provides you that flexibility. And, it's worth noting that, you're only going to get troops to a certain point in a handful of ways, right? You're going to go overland, and if that's not an option, you're going to float them there. And if that's not an option, you're going to fly them there. And so, maintaining that capability and the ability to bring troops in is always going to be something that I think a nation is going to want in their portfolio of capabilities, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. So Jay asked a question, and whether you have the answer or not, I don't know. What did the higher-ups think of the Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy airborne operations? Did they think of expanding or shrinking? There were obviously these mixed results, and then, as you explained, they moved to a defensive stance more than an aggressive stance. But Germany obviously did carry on with airborne soldiers, but used in the elite kind of ground role, and indeed kind of expanded it, with all the Luftwaffe ground troops who were sort of, the air landing brigade. Do we know what the higher ups thought about it as a concept? Was it something that they were always debating?
I think it's an interesting question. So I think, let's break it down by like the Navy. So let's take them first. I think the Navy looked at it largely as a failed experiment. I think they suffered extremely high casualties in both of those operations. And then you see that not long after that, they disbanded their naval parachute capability completely, right? And rolled them more into the naval landing forces. That you can make a strong argument that that's the Navy, and they have a cultural bias towards amphibious operations and naval capabilities. So that might be a big reason that unfolded the way it did. But the Army continued to expand their capability. They started forming, they called them the raiding regiments, and then they had a raiding brigade. And as I mentioned, they also had glider troops as part of that. Those glider troops were never deployed as glider troops in combat. They did use some gliders to bring in reinforcements and extra equipment into the Philippines later. So I think that, again, the Army viewed it differently than the Navy did. The Army viewed it as a capability that they wanted to keep around. And certainly, despite that defensive nature, they saw an opportunity there in the Philippines to use them offensively. And again, but I think, you gotta balance that against the Japanese penchant for continually thinking that they're going to have this decisive battle right there. So the spirit of that was always, aggressiveness, and you can't fault them for that fearless aggressiveness, that they were always going to force the issue with, inflicting higher casualties than the Allies were willing to sustain. So I think that's why the Army probably kept their units around. And then when the opportunity presented itself, they used them on Leyte.
And I'm also thinking about the 1942 expansion era for the Japanese was similar to the 1944 Allied era, when, as we've had shows on the channel with James Daly talking about all the airborne operations that were cancelled between Normandy and Market Garden. I wonder whether in sort of January, February, March 42, the Japanese are sort of over their advance by sea and ground is overtaking in some ways the need for airborne. I wonder if they had a whole list of airborne operations they were thinking about, because Ross Cable, who famously presented on channel about Malaya, saying, I wonder why the Japanese never used paratroops in Malaya, for example. So I wonder whether do you know if they had big ops planned that didn't happen for various reasons?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, they did have several canceled operations. There was a plan to use them in the Aleutian Islands, by way of example. Right. So I know there were several that they had on the books that were canceled. The other thing, frankly, again, this goes back to that, holding history loosely in scholarship. There are conflicting reports around the Japanese using parachute troops in China.
That was another question. Skeptical Observer asked about whether or not there were any airborne ops in China.
Yeah, and I elected not to. So, and again, this is a tough one because you read it and there's some sources will tell you they did, but then when you read some of the eyewitness accounts, to me, it seemed like it was actually aerial resupply, not dropping of troops. And so there was confusion because there was no real follow-up. Like, you've got eyewitness accounts of like, oh, they're dropping troops, but then you have zero eyewitness accounts of those troops actually doing anything. But so again, like I'm wide open to someone finding out more about that. I could not find anything other than those skeptical, conflicting accounts, both in China, and I didn't really find anything in Malaya either. Now, I will say that perhaps the answer to this is that both the naval and Army parachute troops were subordinated to the 16th Japanese Army, which was not the Japanese army that was not responsible for Malaya, if I recall correctly.
Right, okay.
And so it may just be that because they only had limited resources at that time, they wanted them to be more used as shock troops for those airfields and refineries in the Dutch East Indies. That's a little speculation on my part.
It makes sense, and it seems as well when you explain about at the beginning. At least they had that clear purpose in mind. It is to seize airfields, because with the British, particularly with the British, I'm thinking, is that we have the capability and we just don't know. Are we going to go for aqueducts? Are we going to go for stealing things? Are we going to go for hit and run? What are we doing? Airfields? The SAS are doing airfields. The LRDG. We a lot of these operations work very well. A lot of them didn't work so well. We don't really, as Brits, find. No one can agree on what the primary purpose is. At least the Japanese in 42 have kind of got that. This is the primary purpose. So then, therefore, you can build a doctrine, you can build a methodology around that. Whereas the British are leaping, literally leaping from engagement to engagement with a different set of requirements each time.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing you can say for sure is that the Japanese remain true to their doctrine. Almost every one of those operations, except for the very end there, were airfield related, right? I mean, you had
they stuck to their guns. Yeah. Christopher asked about, did the Japanese have any particular cry they did when jumping out the aircraft? And as a former paratrooper, the thing is, it's all this beginning of things that you shout and brotherhoods and jump wings, and I'm assuming the Japanese were exactly the same. Once you become a paratrooper, there's a status and there's a camaraderie around that. So do you know if there's a cry? Is it their jump boots they're proud of? Is their wings? I mean, I presume they must have had wings.
They did. The Army in particular had wings. The naval insignia is a little bit, again, questionable as to whether or not they had them or they wore them or what the status was. There's some back and forth on that. I did not find anything specific to a yell that they had specifically. Now, part of that could just be my poor ability to translate. But you can see from that first picture that we go back to, that guy's clearly yelling something as he's going out of the plane. So you can be assured that they're doing something aggressive there as they're going out. When I jumped, I always just followed the rule book. I just counted to make sure my parachute.
Make sure the chute deploys. I mean, this is the point you're making is, whereas I've got an entire shelf about Arnhem and I've got an entire shelf about the airborne jumps in Normandy, you're stepping into an area that hasn't been given the same studies. People have mentioned like 2 books in the sidebar that they've read about Japanese airborne forces. So it's clearly a very new thing. But before we say goodbye, they're asking you about what your next book is. So I know, but do you want to update the audience on what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So I am, as some of you may know, I'm a former paratrooper and I'm kind of focused on airborne operations. And so I feel like it would be a a missing feather in my cap if I didn't figure out kind of a new angle to talk about Normandy. And so I'm working on a book that is, for lack of a better word, kind of a division level assessment or expose on the 101st attack on Carentan, specifically focusing on the envelopment and then its defense by 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment and the attached units that were part of that conf group.
And I'm really looking forward to that, because it sounds like we don't need that book, but I absolutely do think we do, because the airborne assault gets included in the big books that cover the entire of the Normandy campaign in sort of scant detail. And then you have the massive deep dives into one bloke's experience or one company. But there's not actually that much that's in the middle. The 82nd have had the studies that Phil Nordyke did a few years, and Mark Bando has obviously done some incredible work focusing on certain parts of battle, but there hasn't really been an operational study of the 101st, as you say, divisionally for well, it maybe ever, apart from Rendezvous with Destiny, which covered the whole war.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's kind of where this book, if I'm doing it right, will kind of fill that niche of that again, it's an expose of how do 4 regiments encircle a town, what's in, I certainly will dive down into the individual experiences as well. But it is that, and that's the story of how Utah and Omaha beaches were joined.
Yeah.
And, we kind of take a lot of that for granted. I think it's easy to gloss over, but, both Eisenhower and Bradley were, very concerned about Carentan being in German hands. And I think that's that's an aspect of this book that I'm exploring.
Well, we will look forward to that when that comes out. So, folks, that's it. Me done for today. Tomorrow, Michael Ackerman is coming back on the rescheduled show where he talks about Vierville-sur-Mer and the German defenses there, which is the first appearance on World War II TV since Mike has actually been to Normandy. Because remember, all the first ones were done basically just studying photos and maps, but he has now been here. So we're going to be looking forward to his extra level of forensic data, having actually stomped the grounds. He's been exploring virtually for a year. So I'm looking forward to that tomorrow. In the meantime, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, read their blogs, etc., etc. The links to both James's books are in the description below. I mentioned that earlier. But as for me, I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Cheers, James. Bye.